It's week 5 of 2018. We've got some great stories about apps both on Apple devices as well as Windows devices. We've also got not one, but 2 stories about secret government information being leaked accidentally, and you won't want to miss that. So stay tuned for the ITProTV podcast starting right now. Hello and welcome to the ITProTV podcast. I'm your host, Peter Van Rysdam, and I am joined this week and always by Don Pizzette because it's his office. Don, how you doing?
I'm doing well. Amazing you'd find me in my own office.
It's the strangest thing every week. And as you just saw, it is week 5 of 2018, and we've got a lot of stories to recap this week, really on a whole plethora of things. There isn't one thing dominating. I don't think we have one Meltdown Spectre article this week. There's a couple that I think we can tie back.
There were ones out there that we just chose to skip over because they weren't too exciting.
We're just done with it.
I was a little worried. I don't know about you, Peter, 2 or 3 days ago, where there really just wasn't a lot in the news. I think I had one really relevant article. But, you know, the world saved us over the last 2 and 3 days by doing all sorts of screwy stuff. And so we do actually have a collection of fun news articles to talk about.
Yeah, I had an article about Roseanne is coming back on the air and stuff like that. But luckily
they ordered a pilot for the new Magnum PI. Did you see that?
No, I didn't.
It's going to be horrible.
Yeah, did you hear about Higgins?
No.
All right, so let's move on to our first story of the podcast. And we're going to talk about Apple for a little bit here in these first couple of stories. First one here, iOS 11 is so broken that Apple is reportedly delaying features in iOS 12. And this comes right after I bragged about, going out and spending all that money on the iPhone X.
That's your Christmas present.
Apparently it's just broken. So this is on Gizmodo, but Don, what is broken here? I mean, normally these things break on the older phones and things, but
that's true. The headline has been Gizmodofied, so it's a little bit crazy. iOS 11 is so broken. Well, you're running iOS 11 on your iPhone X.
I am.
Have you been able to make phone calls?
I have.
Have you been able to send text messages?
I have, with full emojis.
Could you browse the internet?
Yes.
So I would argue that it's not so broken, right? The phone works, right? But it's got problems. And this is a challenge that Apple runs into after running under the Steve Jobs regime so long, I can't even say it, where they had such a focus on quality and such an attention to detail that when you got an iPhone, you expected it to just work, right? That was the motto. And so now when there is any little tiny flaw, it turns into articles like these. Now, let me just kind of set aside where my bias is on this one. I actually don't care about which mobile operating system people run. I switch back and forth between iPhone and Android, pretty much every other phone. So I've used both. But in iOS 11, there have been some problems. There was the scandal over slowing phones down to make sure that they got 24 hours of battery life that affected older phones. So that was a big one.
Which sounds like a feature to me. But if you had an older phone.
If they had given people a choice, it would have been a non-issue. But they made the decision. That's Apple's pattern. They make the decision for you. There was the Touch ID, where Touch ID on the newer phones doesn't work as well. And Apple says, well, we're kind of replacing that with the Face ID or facial recognition. So who cares if Touch ID doesn't work so well anymore? But that upset some people. There were a couple of lockup reboot type issues. And in the Android world, I love Android. But all of these issues, I've got them all the time, right? But in iOS, people expect stability. Apple only has a couple of hardware feature sets they have to develop for, so they should have a more stable OS. So Apple is saying, all right, you know what? We're going to hit the pause button on new features. We're gonna delay some of these crazy new features, and for right now, we're gonna focus on making our current iOS stable and secure. Now, I said making our current iOS. They're actually not really doing that. They're saying with iOS 12, when iOS 12 comes out, that it'll have basically stability and security improvements in it to try and get it back to the quality level that it used to be at. I don't know that that's necessarily the right decision, but it will certainly build up some consumer confidence, make people a little happier. But you'll get detractors that say, oh, well, the iPhone, don't even know what the next one's going to be. Is it going to be the iPhone 9 or iPhone 11?
XI.
XI. Oh, that's a good one. Go Roman numerals on us. So with that next one, there'll probably be a Gizmodo article that says, "Oh, new iPhone is pointless. You might as well get the last one. They didn't add any new features." So that's what happens with a lot of these things. But Microsoft did something similar, probably 10 years ago now, where there were so many security exploits coming out for Windows that they finally said, you know what, let's hit the pause button. And this was in the Windows XP days. And they said, we're going to stop releasing new features for a little while, and we're going to focus on security. And they spent almost 2 years just releasing security updates to help shore up the operating system and get it running at the level that it needed to be, and Internet Explorer as well, although most people don't use it anymore. So it's not unheard of for companies to do this.
Well, is this because, do you think they basically designed the operating system for optimal use on the newest and latest and greatest phone? And because, like you said, I actually haven't seen any bugs. I haven't had any reboots, any things that I was having on my older phone, and which was kind of part of the impetus of, okay, I'm ready to go ahead and get a new phone now. If people are talking about Touch ID and things like you said, those don't even exist on the newest, latest, and greatest. So, it seems like to me they've optimized it to run on the latest hardware, and that's where you run into some issues with the older stuff.
That's absolutely true. And it's really visible on the iPads, right? That as your iPad gets a few generations old, you might look at the new iPad and say, well, it doesn't really have any features I need. Why would I buy a new one? But it does have a faster processor, and they optimize the graphics on the screens and things to run, assuming you've got that newer processor. And so on your older one, it looks like it gets slower. The reality is your processor runs at the same speed, but they're expecting it to do more. And eventually you reach a point where your hardware works perfectly fine, but your system is so slow and so overburdened that you feel like you need to buy a new one. And some people call that planned obsolescence, like, oh, they do this on purpose. They're trying to make me buy a new tablet.
How dare they improve the technology?
Well, I can see both sides of this argument, right? But you see it in other industries as well. It's not always like the automotive industry, where if I buy a car, I expect, if I wanted to, I should be able to drive it for 20 years, right? But when I buy a computer, I don't say, I'm going to run this for 20 years. I look at it and I say, well, I'm going to run it for 3 years. But with cell phones and devices that are built in a high-quality fashion, they can last way more than 3 years. But doesn't necessarily mean we should run them. And people didn't care when a cell phone cost $50. But when a cell phone cost $1,000, running it for 3 years, that's a reasonable expectation, I think, at that price point.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like there won't be a reason to get a new iPhone anytime soon because this is something that's been talked about in the past, but Apple plans to bring iOS apps to macOS later this year. So you thought you were annoyed at going to Disney World and seeing people holding up their iPads to take photos. Well, now they'll just be, bringing the whole computer and doing it all from there. Your Instagram and your Snapchats, all right from the OS.
I saw this article and I was thinking the other way around. Like, I don't think this will impact iPads at all. Although iPad sales have been down, but I don't think it'll impact that at all. I think it's going to help macOS. There's been a lot of talk about how Apple has been shifting developers away from macOS and moving them over to their mobile app divisions and their iOS divisions. So we haven't seen a lot of new stuff in macOS. In fact, in macOS High Sierra, the biggest new feature was the Apple File System, APFS, and APFS had already been rolled out on all of the iPhones and all of the iPads. So the biggest new feature in macOS was a feature you already had in the mobile OS. It was a clear sign to me that Apple's considering getting rid of macOS, right? Like, why keep developing that platform? If you go on the macOS App Store, it's practically empty. I mean, there's old apps in there. There's apps that don't have full functionality. It's not a good place to go and buy software. You go in the iOS App Store, though, and it is jam-packed full of the latest stuff, Adobe software, Microsoft Office, all those things. They're in the iOS App Store. So when I saw this, I was like, all right, well, that makes a lot of sense that if you've got this iOS App Store with great apps in it and you can run them on Mac OS, that's going to give a little more life to Mac OS and let that continue on for a few more years. I feel like Apple is right on the edge of having to make a decision and say, are we going to keep Mac OS for our laptop platforms, or are we going to get rid of Mac OS and just run iOS everywhere? iOS can run on a desktop. iOS can run on a Mac Mini or an iMac. The Mac Pro, that's where things start to get dicey when you've got these graphic editors and people that are using those applications in a professional environment. If they lose that, they're going to be a little upset. But I think Apple's already tried to lose some business, like with Final Cut when they did Final Cut X, and it was so bad that most people switched over to Adobe Premiere. So they didn't really care. They were like, okay, enjoy Adobe Premiere. So I think that's the direction they're going. This is similar to what Google did, where Google couldn't make up their mind on the tablet side. Like, do we keep going Android or do we do Chrome OS? Well, Chrome OS could only run web pages. So if you went offline, Chrome OS really lost a lot of its functionality. And they said, well, let's make Android apps run on Chrome OS. And all of a sudden, Chromebook sales went up. And now Google does not sell an Android tablet. If you go to the Google store, they do not sell Android tablets anymore. They just sell Chromebooks. And there's people like me where I never bothered with a Chromebook because it's just a web browser. I can do that anywhere. But now I have a Chromebook instead of an Android tablet because I can fire up the apps right there. So Apple's doing the same kind of thing, and I think we'll see this evolve, but I do think it means that Mac OS is nearing the end of its lifetime.
And it was for different reasons, but Microsoft really did the same thing when they had Windows Mobile going, that they were having such a difficult time getting developers to build mobile apps for the marketplace there, that basically allowing you to kind of have those apps work on the PC when I think it was Windows 8 came out, then that people said, well, now there's a bigger market. Oh, I'm not going to build this app for 100,000 people, but I will build this app for 100 million people that are using Windows. So this is something we've definitely seen before, but there's kind of I love point counterpoints, and we have the kind of counterpoint here. And I was just looking; it's from it's on Yahoo News, but it's actually from Mashable Tech, from Raymond Wong, no relation to our own Ronnie Wong, I don't think. But this says why it makes no sense for Apple to bring iPad apps to Macs, and they're making the argument basically that kind of dumbing down the system a little bit. I mean, it's a little bit of what you talked about, that if you've got this pro machine, is this the best way to go about this?
Well, let me tell you the one big glaring problem with running iOS apps on a Mac. How many Macs have a touchscreen? Do you know?
I don't believe any of them do.
None.
Yeah.
No Macs have a touchscreen. No iMacs, no MacBooks, no MacBook Airs, MacBook Pros, Mac Minis. None of them have a touchscreen.
I've got this little touchscreen down here on the bottom.
Oh, there's a stupid touch
right
bar.
By the keyboard there.
I don't care what industry you're in. That touch bar is pointless.
I haven't touched it before. I don't believe. Yeah.
So none of them have a touchscreen. So a lot of iPad apps and a lot of iOS apps, and when I say a lot, I mean almost all of them, are designed for a touchscreen. So if you bring it over to a MacBook, you're going to have to use your mouse or the touchpad. And now you get that disconnected experience of I'm trying to send touch gestures into an app, but I still have to have that mouse pointer to indicate where my finger is going to be. That's not normal, and that's going to hurt the experience. There's apps like Microsoft Office, right? That'll work fine. You don't have to have a touchscreen to work that. You can work it with a mouse. It'll be okay. But there's other apps like the Adobe Photoshop app, or any of the graphics editing ones where they expect you to have a touchscreen. Pinch to zoom, things of that nature. You can do it on your touchpad, or
there's a lot that use the accelerometer too. I mean, more with the game side of things, but
I didn't even think about the hardware side, like GPS. How many MacBooks have a GPS? None.
I don't think so.
So there's another thing. If it's expecting location services, it's going to have to estimate based on the wireless network you're on. So those are all things that Apple could fix if they released a whole new line of MacBooks that had touchscreens. And boy, I'd buy one of those if it had a touchscreen, because you could use it for so many things. But I don't know that we'll see that.
Which I've never understood. Why, I don't know why. Do you know why they've made that decision that they're not going touch?
So I've got this theory, right? And they said that it doesn't make any sense. People don't want to reach up and touch their laptop. That's what they said. It's not a good user experience, right? But that touch bar, the touch bar is right up there at the top of your keys. It removes keys that you normally would expect to have, right? And it actually has the iPad's logic board behind it to power that little touch bar. They could have just done a whole touch screen and taken 20 pixels off the bottom of the screen and turned that into the touch bar, and then you'd have the advantage of a whole touchscreen, and it would have been cheaper than that touch bar because that's a $300 option. A touch screen cost them like $20 extra to manufacture. That would have been the better route to go. I think they didn't do it because everybody else was doing it, and they wanted to be different. How do you set yourself apart when you're just doing something all your competition is doing? So I think that's what led to the touch bar. The touch bar is pretty, it's got colors and lights up and stuff, but it's just not as functional. And most of the people that have it don't use it.
Which the weirdest thing to me is this device. They've gone completely USB-C on this, but for some reason, I've got a headphone jack, which they've taken that away from my phone because who needs a headphone jack anymore? But they've said, you know what? We're going to change everything to USB-C, but we're going to leave that headphone jack because you obviously need a headphone jack. So,
well, they have more room to work with, I suppose.
That's thinking differently. So.
Yeah.
And speaking of thinking differently, apparently, I don't know if you knew this, but Apple makes servers as well. Something I wasn't aware of until reading this article. So it says, prepare for changes to macOS server. This is coming from Apple's own website. And I'm really excited about these changes because, like I said, I didn't realize anyone actually served things on Apple devices. But you seemed excited.
Oh, yeah. If you're not familiar with this, years ago, Apple sold rack-mounted servers as part of their OS X line. Then they made the decision that there just wasn't enough sales there, so they stopped doing that, and they took the server software and they just made it an app. You can go into the Mac App Store that I said was barren and void. You can go in there and you can find the Mac OS server app. It used to be called the OS X server app. Now it's called the Mac OS server app. And the Mac OS server app, it cost a whopping $20, and you can install it on any Mac, and now your Mac is a server. And it has a number of different features. You can set up like a network time machine server. You can set up an Apple Open Directory server, so you can have synchronized user accounts between your systems. You can do contacts, calendar, email. You can do a DNS server, DHCP. You can run all these different services right there on your Mac. And that's all because under the hood, your Mac is running BSD Unix. And all of these services that I just mentioned were really designed under BSD Unix. Well, maybe not Time Machine, but DNS and all those other ones were kind of designed in that environment. So you can run them. Well, I said just a moment ago that Mac OS, I think Apple's on that edge of the line where they're trying to decide whether they're going to keep it around or not. And here's another kind of nail in that coffin for Mac OS. They're stripping out several of the services from Mac OS Server. Now, Mac OS Server has not seen a significant update in like 7 years. It's been a long time since they've added any new exciting feature to it. They've done bug fixes and version updates, but no real new features. Well, now they're actively cutting things out. In fact, from the knowledge base article that Apple pushed out, they're killing off, and they haven't killed it off yet, right? So in the current version of macOS Server, it has this stuff, but in spring of 2018, in other words, the next version that's going to come out, they're removing calendar, contacts, DHCP, DNS, mail, messages, net install, VPN, websites, and wiki. All of that is going away. All right. Now, if you're not familiar with the product, you might be asking yourself,
yeah, what's left?
What is left, right? And there's not much. So there's the network time machine service will be there. The file sharing services will be there. There's an NFS server and a few other things. Those will stay there. There's also the profile manager. And in my opinion, the profile manager is the reason to buy a macOS server. It's what makes that $20 a no-brainer. With profile manager, you can define a bunch of settings, right? All the different settings to customize a Mac. And it creates it as a profile, and you can deploy that out. So if you have 1,000 Macs in your environment and you want them all to have the same wallpaper, you can create a profile that sets the wallpaper and then push it out to all 1,000 of them, right? And if somebody changes the wallpaper, the next time the profile applies, it just puts it back again, right? So you can consistently configure all of your Macs. It makes life super easy in a business environment, right? The profile manager is still there, and you may not know this, but the profile manager doesn't just work on Mac OS. You can manage your iPhones and your iPads as well as your Apple TVs. So if you have an app that you want to push out to all the iPhones in your company, you can do that from the profile manager. So what Apple has done is they've trimmed off all of the features except for the ones that support iOS. And that, to me, is another indicator saying, I think macOS is on the way out. And why keep it around if all of our app development is on that iOS platform? let's shift over to that. Now, what they're missing, some of the things that would stop them from making that flip, is you can't really develop iOS apps on an iOS device yet. So right now, if you want to run Xcode, you've got to run it on Mac OS. So they've got to find a way to replace that. But if that were to happen, I think Mac OS would be gone.
I mean, after how good High Sierra has been, it would be amazing to me
It's
that
been
they
a
would make
rocky
a
start,
decision
hasn't
like
it?
that. Yeah, still haven't gone there. I get reminded every couple days, but haven't done it yet. Well, we wanted to switch gears for a little bit now, and we've beat up on Apple enough, so let's beat up on Microsoft for a minute. But we'll start with a good story. So Windows 10 finally beats out an 8-year-old operating system. So the 8-year-old operating system would be Windows 7. Okay, yeah. So they just skipped right past 8 there. But yeah, Windows 10, is the big dog now. It looks like. So does that mean anything for administrators out there?
So at this point, I think everybody's learned the lesson that with Microsoft, you always skip every other operating system, right? So like when Windows 98 came out, or Windows 3.1 was really big. Everybody ran it. Windows 95, pretty rocky. Windows 98, really good, especially second edition. Windows Millennium Edition, not so good, right? Windows 2000 also had its little quirks. Windows XP, really good. Then you have Windows Vista, really bad, right? Windows 7, really good. Then Windows 8, really bad. Even 8.1, really bad, right? Windows 10, really good again, right? So we know to skip every other OS. So that should tell us, hey, Windows 10 is really good, right? But that doesn't mean you want to jump in on day one. And Windows 10 did have some issues, in day one and some concerns. Microsoft was giving out the upgrade for free to try and get people switched over to it. But you still saw people clinging on to Windows 7. And from Microsoft, they kill off support after a period of years, right? For most of us, it's after just 5 years. But for businesses, it can be 7 to 10 years. So they're looking at this and saying, look, Windows 10's been out a while. Most people skipped over Windows 8, but a lot of people are still clinging to Windows 7. We need Windows 10 to be successful. Well, finally, the numbers have shown where more people have Windows 10 installed than Windows 7. And so that means that now is the time where if there's businesses that have been holding off doing that update, it's more than likely safe because there's enough of an install base that are out there that if there are weird quirks and bugs, they're being detected and found and fixed. So that means that the Windows 10 is now kind of like the go-to OS if you're in that Windows world.
Yeah, and just to put some actual numbers with this, Windows 10 is running on 42.78% of Windows computers in January 2018 versus 41.86% for Windows 7. This is according to StatCounter. And that equates to Windows 10 being installed on over 500 million devices. This is as of last May, which is good, but is still short of the goal that they'd predicted back in 2015 to be on 1 billion devices. So if they can get rid of all those Windows 7 machines somehow, they will go ahead and hit that number. But it's impressive.
I thought it was interesting in the article. So it's a Gizmodo article, but the stats are coming from StatCounter. Let me bring this up here. You can see where they kind of show that map of how Windows 7 is declining and Windows 10 is going up. So there's that crossover. But I thought it was really interesting that Windows 8 is in third place, right? And they separate out 8 and 8.1, so it would actually be a little bit higher than what it is here. But Windows XP and Windows Vista still on the charts, right? Yeah. So they're still
that one's
there.
Going up. What's the green one down there? Or the second from the bottom?
That bluish one. That is.
That is 8.
That's just regular Windows 8. You're right. It is going up. What the heck's that all about?
Good
it declines at the end, but interesting stuff. So. Neat to see that coming along, and in the Windows world, I've been running Windows 10. I don't actually have any Windows 7 machines anymore, but Windows 7 was really stable. I didn't hate Windows 8. Once you got used to the start menu going away, which was really no different than like GNOME and Linux, so it worked out for me. But most people hated it, and Windows 10 fixed a lot of that.
Well, if Microsoft were smart here, they would just spend about maybe $10,000 to promote Windows 11, and just know that they're just going to move on, and Windows 12 or whatever name we come up for that,
skip a version,
Windows High Sierra, I don't know.
People thought they were trying to do that with Windows 10 because they skipped Windows 9.
Yeah. Okay.
right?
Yeah.
But that actually turned out to be a little code bug. That there was a lot of software that was written that would say, we need to know if we're running on Windows 95 or 98. So they would check to see, am I running Windows 9 star, right? And if they were, they knew they were on 95 or 98. So if they made a new version called Windows 9, it would screw up all this backwards compatible code. So that's why they skipped the number. I don't think we'll see them skip a number again, but I wonder about Apple, where you had the iPhone 8 and then the iPhone 10. Are they going to go back and do an iPhone 9? I don't know. We'll see.
Instead of an 8C, they'll go to just a 9, apparently.
A 9 SE, whatever.
Exactly, the plastic one. All right, well, sticking with Microsoft and kind of along these same lines of what we've been talking about, both with Microsoft and Apple here, Microsoft Office 2019, it was announced that it will only work on Windows 10. So going back to kind of talking about how different programs on Apple will only work on the newer things or only work well on the newer operating systems. That's a decision that Microsoft's made here, which I understand why something that's optimized for Windows 10 may not work on Windows 95, Windows XP, but I'd be surprised. I'm surprised that it wouldn't work on 8, because they're still in that kind of new touch UI.
So this is not a technical restriction, right? This is a policy restriction. So I mentioned how a lot of businesses, they don't like to upgrade right away, right? If I've got 10,000 computers and they're all licensed for Windows 7, what's my motivation to go to Windows 10, right? Even if you have an enterprise agreement and it's free, the upgrade is free if you've paid the hundreds of thousands of dollars for your enterprise agreement. But if you're under that kind of agreement, what's your motivation to upgrade from Windows 7 to Windows 10? There really isn't one, right? There's not a shining feature in Windows 10 that you have to have that you're not going to have in Windows 7. So there are tons of businesses that say, look, Windows 7 is still supported. We're not going to upgrade. So how does Microsoft get you to upgrade? They're giving you the upgrade for free. So that should be motivation. But if you're still not upgrading, well, for businesses, hitting them with Microsoft Office, that'll usually do it. So that's what they're doing here. Office 2019 is only going to work on Windows 10. Let me clarify that when Microsoft says Office 2019, in their terminology, they don't mean the mobile apps. So the Android app and the iOS app, those stay. Those aren't going away. It's not saying that you can only do this on Windows 10. They're really saying we're not supporting Windows 8 or Windows 7 anymore with new versions of Office. Well, businesses, not only do they not like to update their OSs, they don't like to update Microsoft Office either. And I know people right now that are still running Office 2003. And you look at it, wow, that's 15 years old. But honestly, if you're making a document or a spreadsheet, it's not like the new versions of Office add a ton of features that you have to have. I'd say they add very few features that you have to have.
There's the ribbon.
The ribbon, yeah.
It's all about the ribbon.
Some people like, some people don't. But that's it. Like Microsoft's Office product is very, very powerful, very feature rich. But with each version, it's not a huge motivation. The only motivation to really upgrade is when they end support for a version. And so that's what we're starting to see. But it was kind of surprising to see that they just said Windows 10 and that's it.
And I wonder if it goes the other way too, where older versions of Office won't run on newer operating systems. Like, so if you were running Windows 10, could you run Office 2003?
Yeah, I imagine eventually that'll break down. A lot of those Office versions depend on .NET and the .NET framework. So all Microsoft has to do is kill off one of those .NET frameworks, and then Office goes along with it. I'd be surprised if that happened, but it certainly could.
And this is saying in the article here that they'll release preview copies in the middle of 2018, and then probably later in 2018 is when the actual Office 2019 will come out for the world. So look for that on your Windows 10 devices. All right, now switching over to the red-hatted stepchild of operating systems.
Jumping over to Linux.
Try to do that there.
All
yeah,
right,
it didn't really work.
There wasn't a ton of news in the Linux world this week, but one article that popped up on the Phoronix website was about Red Hat acquiring CoreOS. Now, CoreOS, if you haven't heard of it, is a specific distribution of Linux designed to support container deployments, right? If you deploy Kubernetes and you want to have it running super fast and stable, the underlying OS has to be super fast and stable, and CoreOS was specifically designed for that. Now, Red Hat already has a server operating system, and in Fedora, they've been testing out a lot of things like a modular OS where you pick the components that you want. And so you could say, I just want the container components, which would effectively be Core OS. But they haven't had much luck. In fact, Fedora canceled their modular program. They threw all the code away and said, we're starting over again, right? Well, at Red Hat Corporate, they said, you know what, let's acquire somebody who's already doing a good job with it, and that was Core OS. So it's kind of been its own independent project up until now. It's gotten a lot of support from Intel and Google and a few other companies. Now it's under the Red Hat umbrella. Ansible is also under the Red Hat umbrella. You know, they acquired them last year. So Red Hat is really going into containers and automated deployments, and this is a further investment in that. So if you haven't tried Core OS yet, check it out. It is a neat OS. The team over at Phoronix, they've been doing a number of articles on performance and stuff, and it is focused on performance. Now, it's not something you want to run on your own laptop, but for server deployments, it does a great job, and many of the big cloud providers have started to use it. So we'll continue to see that growing. It's just more of Red Hat's adoption of that containerized deployment space.
I have not tried that yet, so I'll go ahead and can I run that on my Mac server?
It's at least as stable as High Sierra.
Oh, fantastic. Let's jump right on that. Well, now switching gears one more time. I know I said that there weren't any Meltdown Inspector articles, and there aren't, but I couldn't help in the back of my mind reading this headline next, thinking that, you know, maybe there's some relationship here. But Samsung has taken over the chip-making crown from Intel as the largest chip maker. This is by revenue, not number of chips out in the market. But, you know, couldn't help but think this had something to do with, you know, the like stain that's on Intel.
You know,
now.
it could, but security flaws like that, it's only been 2 months now.
Yeah, this
so
has obviously been in the works for a while.
Yeah, when you're bulk ordering chips like that, these are normally done months, if not years in advance. I think this is just indicating the trend of mobile applications, right? Intel has not made a dent in the mobile device space yet, right? There are Intel-powered Android phones, but there's not that many of them. Chromebooks are mostly Intel-powered, but there are other ones that are ARM-based. Apple phones, they use their own custom processors, some of which are actually manufactured by Samsung, because the manufacturing plants that build these chips are very specialized, and there's only a handful of companies that are actually able to manufacture those at a high yield rate. Samsung is one of those companies, and they're really good at it. So they manufacture these chips. They're active in the mobile space. The mobile space is the fastest one that's growing, and as a result, they've now surpassed Intel. So you've got this great historical chip maker, Intel, that dominated the market. You know, companies like Cyrix, you may not even remember them anymore, that used to be big chip makers. Now they're gone. AMD, that is a shadow of what it used to be, more popular for their graphics chipsets now than their CPUs. As far as chip manufacturers, that whole landscape has been Intel all this time. So to see somebody surpass them is a pretty big deal. We'll have to see if they hold it.
Yeah, and what's interesting, too, in this article, it says it's also a testament to the growth of memory chips, which is Samsung's main market. So what's the difference there? What are memory chips?
Sure.
I mean, those are the little SD cards? And
a CPU is packed full of transistors, lots and lots, millions of transistors, right, that are gates that open and close and perform logic operations. But a memory chip is storage, like SSDs or RAM, DRAM, SDRAM, all that other stuff. And these aren't so much about like a gate that's open and closed as they are just storing a 1 or a 0 and being able to quickly retrieve that information. Well, Intel doesn't manufacture memory, right? There are some Intel branded SSDs, and so they manufacture those, but Samsung manufactures way more. The Samsung EVOs are incredibly popular in desktops. You're starting to see Macs that have the memory, the storage memory soldered right onto the board, so you can't upgrade them. The NVMe movement that we're seeing in laptops where you get that ultra-fast storage. But RAM is advancing pretty quick too. Graphics adapters all have RAM built into them now, and Samsung makes that. Toshiba and a couple of other companies make it as well, but Samsung makes the most.
All right, sounds good. Well, we talked a minute ago when we were talking about Red Hat about containers And this next article is on that same topic here. Cisco is jumping into containers with Kubernetes becoming their partner of choice, it looks like, for their new container orchestration platform. So what does this mean for us as Cisco admins?
So, Cisco has been kind of floundering in the market. Their big market 10 years ago was routers and switches. And they made the best routers, they made the best switches, and they dominated that market, right? But routers and switches are another area that hasn't really evolved much. In the last 10 years, there have not been any new features in routers and switches that are significant, right? Layer 3 switching has come down in price, but that's really about it. And so when it comes to purchasing a switch these days, buying one from Cisco or Extreme Networks or Juniper or HP, they're all about the same. And so they just compete on price. So there's not a lot of innovation going on in that space. So Cisco has to evolve. And their stock price was sinking for a long time. And so now they're trying to figure out how they're going to correct that. And they dabbled in security with their ASA devices. They acquired the Pix company 15 years ago. And so they've been moving into that and been doing okay. They dabbled in voice over IP, right, with all of their unified communications hardware. They dabbled in wireless with their AeroNet. But again, they're not really competing. There's no features that they have that set them apart from the competition other than their name, right? We're Cisco. We've been around a long time. So now what their latest push has been is in the data center. And their data center switches, they're like their NX switches, are phenomenal. The software-defined networking that they have is integrated into VMware and several other products. So you get this nice, easy distribution of logical networks across your virtualized environment. That's really powerful. And that stuff is incredibly expensive. So they make a lot of money on it, right? Well, this is more data center activity. People are using containers. If you've got virtual networks, the containers need to know about the virtual networks. You've got to coordinate all that. You've got to have some kind of orchestration. And instead of creating something from the ground up or acquiring somebody else like Cisco normally does, this time they just said, look, Kubernetes is obviously leading the pack here, so we're just going to adopt that. But now you can get that as part of their orchestration program. So you don't have to learn Kubernetes yourself. You can have it managed by Cisco or integrated in with your Cisco products, and it gives you that single platform to go in and manage. They call it the Cisco Container Platform, or CCP, which is a little annoying because Cisco's had like 3 products over the years called CCP, so this is yet another one. But it's them moving into the data center space. Now, if you work for a large enterprise, that's important to you because you might have adopted Cisco's enterprise products like this. But do keep in mind that the major cloud providers, the Azures, the AWS, the Google Compute, they're not using this technology. So the major deployments aren't using it. And small and medium businesses can't afford it. So this is targeted really just towards enterprise. I don't know if this is going to work out for them long term, but it's the latest thing that they focused on.
Yeah, that's kind of the initial thought I had when you mentioned that, is that the cloud providers are the ones buying a lot of that kind of hardware now, and the small businesses are buying less and less of that, and their the amount of switches and all kinds of things going on in their server room, I feel like there's less now because they're relying on those cloud providers to have those things. So that's an interesting play, definitely, to see how that's going to work out.
Well, think about us. That here in our building, we used to have all of our servers in-house before we moved it all out to the cloud. Every single bit of it. All of our servers are out there in the cloud now. We used to always buy Dell servers, Dell Power Edges, right? When we moved to the cloud, we actually had the same amount of machines. They're just virtual now instead of physical. And, well, that means that whoever we're hosting these on, they have to buy the servers too, right? But like Google, they build their own servers. Amazon, they build their own servers. They're not buying them from Dell. And so that hurts a company like Dell or whoever we used to buy those servers from. It's just a changing economy.
Yeah. Well, you were touting how great all that Cisco hardware was. So now to our next article. This is from crn.com. Cisco issues a critical firewall security vulnerability alert for VPN devices. And that sounds frightening.
This one's a big deal. Yeah, it's basically, Cisco used to really rely on IPsec VPNs, where you had to run this Cisco VPN client and connect up, and it was all done through IPsec. But about 10 years ago, they pushed everybody to this newer technology that was SSL based. so that you didn't necessarily have to have a client installed. You could browse to your VPN endpoint, usually one of their firewalls, and if you needed the client, it could actually install it as like a plugin in your web session and build a tunnel via SSL. It passed through firewalls easier. It was easier for end users to use, and it worked out pretty well. So that really got pushed out. It was called Cisco AnyConnect, and you saw really everything get moved over to it. And they finally end of life the old VPN client, and that's the way they want you to connect now. Well, SSL means that the initial connection is coming in on a WebSocket. So you basically have a web server. And some security researchers found a flaw where you could push a specific XML file over to that WebSocket listener, and you could then get it to execute arbitrary code. And they showed where you could actually take over the firewall. And once you took over the firewall, you could do whatever you wanted because you had the firewall. You could open up holes in the firewall and allow traffic through. You could change the VPN's key generation, so now you could decrypt all the data in the VPN. You could reroute the VPN traffic. You could do whatever you wanted. So you could completely invalidate the functionality of that firewall, right? And that's bad because the firewall is that first line of defense from traffic on the outside coming inside. It's a pretty critical failure.
Well, the good news is that we're hearing this from Cisco and not from some story about all of our personal information being hacked and all that. So they are saying that they've issued free software updates that they say will solve the problem. So at least this went through those proper channels, I guess.
Yeah, and that free part that you mentioned, right? Normally with Cisco, you have to have a Cisco SmartNet agreement, like an extended warranty, in order to get updates. If you don't do SmartNet, you can still run your hardware, but you can't get updates. So this one is so bad that they're actually pushing the update out for free. Like, you can have this, because it's also not really an update to iOS, it's an update to the web service that powers SSL. So, that update, they are making it available, so everybody should do that update as soon as possible. The exploit it's actually really easy to do. This is not a hard one that requires an amazing amount of technical knowledge. Now that the exploit is out there, it's easy to exploit, and you're going to see people doing that. If that happens, it's a big deal. Now, the firewalls that were affected, it's pretty much across the board. The 5500X series, those are incredibly popular branch firewalls. So businesses that have a headquarters and then have hundreds or thousands of branch offices, they'll usually have 5500Xs out there. They are compromised. The 1000V cloud firewall, that's the virtual one that's used in AWS and Azure and a few other places, that one is compromised. The Firepower, right, the new series, the next generation firewalls, all of them are compromised. And the Catalyst series switches and 7600 series routers, or not all the Catalyst, sorry, the 6500s, the ones that have the firewall blade, those are compromised as well. This is basically the starting lineup of Cisco's hardware right here. As you look down this list, these are their big security devices, and every one of them has the vulnerability. So if you're not using the web-based VPN functionality and it's disabled, then you're not vulnerable to this. But the default is that the configuration is enabled, it's turned on, but it's just not, it doesn't have any connection credentials, so it can't be used. That can be exploited. So if you're not using it, you need to disable it, or better, do the update. Once you update, it's taken care of, and the problem's no longer there.
And it sounds like they realize that giving that update away free is cheaper than the lawsuits that would come if they did not give it away free.
Yeah, that's true.
All right, so we've got another big story that was going around this week, and we're not going to get too deep into it, but there was a cryptocurrency hack where more than $500 million was stolen.
No way.
Yeah,
that is shocking news.
Yeah, that it was still worth $500 million, or
that
it was stolen. If you recall, a few weeks back we had a show where we brought Duncan Cabinu in, who is an expert on all things cryptocurrency, and helped us kind of understand how that all works. And that was right before. I don't know if it's because of that show that Bitcoin tanked. But it very well could be. But anyway, this one took place in Japan, and really we brought it up because we wanted to talk about how something like this happens, and more so the subsequent articles that are coming out of this after the fact. Now that the coin check hackers are trying to move the stolen cryptocurrency, and basically people are able to know that they're moving that. Because I said to Don when I saw this, how is this possible? Because I thought the whole point here was that this is completely anonymous, and once I have that string of numbers, that this is mine and I can do whatever I want with it, and no one knows who I am. So is this just the only thing I could think is it's some sort of machine learning where they said, hey, we've got this massive amount of people trying to sell off now, so this is clearly the person that hacked it? Or how could they know who this is?
It's actually a lot simpler than that, right? It is a common misconception that Bitcoin is, or that any blockchain technology is completely untraceable, right? You hear people say that, and they're wrong, right? The way blockchain works is with what's called a shared ledger. So every time you make a transaction, the transaction is published publicly, and it's sent out to all of the Bitcoin miners that are processing that blockchain. And as soon as 51% of that environment recognizes the transaction, it's now considered to be committed, and everybody knows that transaction occurred. It's a public ledger. I want to use like a checkbook reference here, but I know most people don't know what a checkbook is anymore. But, we used to have to balance our checkbook. So every time you spent a little money, you'd write, minus $25 or minus $100. And then when you got your paycheck, you'd add in, plus $500 or whatever.
You see that in your online statement now. So
okay, yeah,
we'll take that.
When you read a statement, and so it shows the money going out, money coming in, and it creates a ledger, a paper trail of where that money went. Well, in blockchain, you have that paper trail. So here's this wallet. Here's a wallet code. And $500 million just went into it. Okay? Well, then I see $100 million come out and go to this other wallet. And then another $100 million goes to this other wallet. And you can follow it. You know exactly where it is. So people can see exactly where that $500 million went. And then as it gets distributed out, they can see exactly where it's going and the wallet that it finally ends up at. And then the Bitcoin exchange or whatever that it finally hits, where it then exits the Bitcoin ledger and it leaves, right? You can see that whole path, all booked in the open, clear as day. You don't need crazy forensics and science and all that. It's right there in the ledger. What you don't see is who controls that wallet, because the wallet is just a code, right? So while blockchain doesn't give you, invisible transactions, it gives you anonymity, right? We have no idea who owns the wallet. So that $500 million went into a wallet owned by somebody. And there's a private key that secures that wallet, and we don't know that key, right? And it would take thousands of years to guess the key. Well, then as it travels along, we don't know who controls those other wallets. And maybe through crazy science and research, we can search on those wallet codes and find where it matches up with somebody. Maybe on social media one day I did a Patreon or a charity run, and I said, hey, help support me in this charity run, donate Bitcoin to this wallet code. And now people know that wallet code is tied to me, and they might find it. But anybody can generate a wallet code any day. So hackers don't typically reuse them. And we have no idea who these are tied to.
And we don't know if that's if the transactions we're seeing is the hacker moving the money between their own wallets, or if it's them buying a service from someone and to kind of essentially launder that money. So the person that has it at the end might be someone who gave something to the hacker, and so you can't necessarily make that connection. I think now this kind of makes sense to me, because I was reading in the article, it was saying that we're able to track this money, we're able to get some of this money back potentially, but at the end it said, and we expect that the hackers will get away with X amount. And I was like, well, if you can tell all this, how are they getting away? But that's the point, that if they're able to spread it far enough and get some of it out of the exchanges, that money's then off the books, as it were. But if they're able to kind of take some of the money back, essentially, then they're not going to get away with a full 530 million. They're going to get away with much less.
Yeah, and I think of it as like a convenience store robbery, right? That if somebody puts on a ski mask and they rob a convenience store, well, there's video footage. There's the person who did it, right? We can see them do it. They take the money, they leave. I can see it, right? But I don't know who they were. They were wearing a ski mask. So blockchain is really like a technical ski mask. And so that's what we've got right here. Or if we want to get fancy, what is it, balaclava? That's a fancy word for ski mask.
Oh, yes.
I don't know, trying to make it sound a little more technical.
Isn't that like a Danish? Baklava, are we talking?
Oh, no, that's the food.
Yeah, well, that's delicious, right. But it will also hide your identity.
That is trackable.
But yeah, so I guess the moral of the story is go ahead and steal away. You're not going to get it all, but you'll definitely get enough to
and
be
people
rich.
make mistakes, right? There was the Silk Road guy where they were able to tie his wallet code to his identity because he had posted somewhere once about taking donations, or he did a transaction on some legitimate site and paid for it with funds that came from that wallet code. And so they can find that stuff. But these teams that are committing the really big thefts, they're not dumb people. They're smart enough to say, hey, we'll generate temporary wallets, we'll use that to move it around, and then find a way to exit the system.
Well, you'd expect they'd be good after being trained by the North Korean government for all these years. So, that training's finally paying off, and
That's
good,
right.
Good for them. So now let's change over to a story that actually both Don and I think came across independently, but was really interesting. So, I've got my Fitbit tracker here, and it's telling me how many steps I have. Some of the fancier ones have the GPS and let you map your run, and that all seems great, and you want to share that information with your friends. But you don't want to do that if you're a member of the military and you're in covert ops or in places around the world where we're trying to keep that a secret, and that is unfortunately what happened. Strava is a social network for athletes, and it was revealed that it was basically sharing this location data for U.S. military personnel. And this is not a malicious thing. This is not something that they were trying to do to steal this information or make it public. But it's just a feature of the app, basically, and could get people in some hot water.
This was one that was people not understanding how data can be misused, right? Yeah. So you have a fitness app, and it tracks your runs. And this one was from a Strava, I think was the company.
Yeah.
And it tracks your runs, so you can track your progress, and then you can share your progress with your friends. And in fact, they make it anonymous. They create these little heat maps so you can see how many other people are running in my neighborhood. Applications like Waze do this, right? And you could see these like large densities of people running in areas where you wouldn't normally expect them to be. And in this case, they could also do little profile pictures. And some of them were doing profile pictures of them in uniform or with the military base in the background. And so you could say, oh, there's a base there. Yeah. And here's all these runners that, hey, they're fit, they're soldiers, right? It makes sense.
Yeah.
But
why are they running at 4 a.m. around this compound?
Because they got to get more done by 9 a.m. than
that's true.
Most people get done in a day. So it's basically giving that information out, and it's not. It's almost like the child predators online, right? Where they strike up a conversation. Hey, what city do you live in? That seems like fairly innocent information. Or how old are you? But they can piece that together. And now they can actually find you in person, right? It's really bad. So we've kind of learned to not do that. But with a fitness tracker, we might not think about it. It could be as simple as, you do a social media post that says, hey, I'm really looking forward to my vacation next week. Well, somebody could look at that and say, okay, I'm looking forward to breaking into your house next week because I know you're not going to be home, right? So the way information gets misused, and here it was military personnel, so that makes it worse. I loved the quote. Where was it? Where one of the analysts said this was 10,000 screw-ups.
Yeah,
right?
This is what 10,000 individual innocent screw-ups look like.
And once you do that, you identify this density of people in one area, and now you found this Air Force base. Now, you mentioned U.S. The example they gave here was a Royal Air Force, right? So UK. So I don't know, was there more than one country involved?
I don't know. It said at the top that they were talking about, U.S. military is reviewing their security practices after this was released. So I don't know that there was any data about U.S. military, but it does mention that at some point soldiers were given Fitbit Flex wristbands, 20,000 in total. So I don't think those do the GPS tracking.
Oh, that would be more embarrassing if
they
were actually giving them these tools that leak the information. But here's the Strava heat map showing the Mogadishu airport, so you can
Yeah,
See, we're
heavy jogging in the area.
which I think everybody knows there's a military presence in Mogadishu, but
Yeah.
some of these other areas we don't necessarily know.
Yeah, I think the biggest takeaway for me was that apparently the Bin Laden raid it burned about 700 calories per soldier. So that was interesting. I thought it would have been higher. Another fun, embarrassing story.
Last week we
this
went out
just
on a
baffled
bang,
me.
right?
Yeah.
Last week we had that Jeopardy story that was ridiculous. So we found another one this week that was really entertaining. So this is our crazy off the wall article for the week.
Yeah, and has just a series of great coincidences. So basically, the Australian intelligence service decided, hey, we need some new file cabinets, and let's get rid of these old ones. No one thought to check if they were full of classified documents. And so I don't know if it was a garage sale or Craigslist or whatever Outback list they have there, but what makes this even better to me is they were sold and they were bought by the Australian Broadcasting Company. So it's basically they just handed this over to the media, and then the Australian Broadcasting Company (ABC) was good enough to notify them, hey, we found all your stuff. But that's not before, Don, you pointed out something interesting that you read.
Yeah, the article we've got here is from CNN, and their headline was pretty conservative. Australian government secrets revealed after confidential files sold by accident. The original article I read actually used this quote down here. One of the biggest breaches of cabinet security in Australian history. So this is a massive compromise of not just secret, but like top secret documents that were covering cabinet conversations that weren't public, right? That weren't ever
Okay.
intended
Okay, you're
to become
talking
public.
about cabinet. When you said
like
cabinet, I was
cabinet
thinking,
numbers, yeah.
wow, one of the biggest breaches. How
One-
many file cabinets have they sold over the years?
A lot of breach cabinets.
Cabinet. Okay.
And so when I saw that, I was like, oh, great. Hackers got into their system, broke data out. This didn't even involve computers at all, right? There was a file cabinet packed full of documents, right? And those documents were all top secret. And they decided they were going to replace the cabinet and they were going to sell it, right? So they sold it. They sell this stuff at auction or surplus, and somebody bought it. No keys provided, right? They didn't have keys because the keys were likely secured because this was top secret data. So whoever bought the cabinets, and it wasn't the ABC that bought the cabinets, but some regular person bought the cabinets, and they just used a drill to drill out the locks, and then they found top secret confidential documents from the Australian government. So they did what any responsible citizen would do and took it to the nearest media outlet, which is a little suspect, but that's what they did. Now, the ABC, they said, we're going to do the responsible thing. We're going to contact the Australian government, and they did. And so one of the security agencies, I'm not exactly familiar with all of the security agencies in Australia, but this was one of the more important ones, came out with 2 giant safes. They loaded up all the papers, and they toted them off in safes because even they weren't rated high enough to handle the top secret documents. They had to have another security agency come and actually finally secure the documents that were in the safes. Now, the ABC, they made a comment that kind of went by the wayside in most articles. Now, I'm trying to see if CNN reported on it, but they said that, they actually did right here. It says, the ABC reported that it still has access to the files and talks are underway with the government about how to proceed. Now, if they turned over all the paper files, but they're saying they still have access, what does that mean? They scanned them. I bet they scanned every single one of those pages, and they, trying to be responsible, turned the documents back over to the government, probably because they were legally obligated, like the physical papers, but they've scanned them. This data is now completely leaked, and they're sifting through it. This is a great example about how important security controls are and how it's not firewalls and packet inspection and IPS devices. None of those would have helped here. This is all about data disposal and data custodianship. Like, they should have had better processes in place that once a document is classified, it has an age. And when it reaches the end of that age, it gets destroyed or disclosed. And if it's being locked in a file cabinet, that file cabinet should be secured. And this whole series of events never should have happened. And it just shows where, like, computers aren't always the weak link in security. And here it's people. Like, people were the problem here.
Yeah, and people seems to be the problem in a lot of security cases, whether it's computer related or not. My favorite quote here is from the opposition Labor Party leader Bill Shorten, who said, "All the spies who are meant to be spying on us, they should just be going shopping in secondhand furniture stores." 'Cause basically, that's what's happening. So, I mean, I know people that watch the government auctions here in the United States,
Yeah.
and you've got to assume that someone has gone through those things. But when this filing cabinet's being sold without the key, that should be an indication of
And when it's
whoever
heavy.
sold it. Yeah, exactly. Well, I don't know. We moved file cabinets in this building when we moved into our current space, and we have a financial services company in the building. And in those file cabinets, I mean, they were fire rated, so they had the concrete in them.
Even
so
if they're empty, they're heavy.
I wouldn't assume that there had been anything in them. They better have unloaded those cabinets before I moved them.
Speaking of governments, did you see, we don't have this article on the books here, but did you see the follow-up on the false Hawaiian missile alert?
I saw that apparently the guy had mistaken 2 or 3 drills before.
So here's the thing, right? We talked about this a few weeks ago. In Hawaii, a text message alert went out to every cell phone early in the morning saying that there was an intercontinental ballistic missile, right?
Yeah.
A missile was incoming. You needed to get to a shelter immediately, right? And then it said, "This is not a drill," right? Well, turns out it was a drill,
Yeah,
and it was supposed to be a practice run, but the operator, so they said in the beginning, pushed the wrong button, right? Well, it turns out the operator, totally not at fault. Not his fault. He pushed the right button because they were doing a drill. But in the wording of the alert in the drill, it says, "This is not a drill." And so he read that. It says, "This is not a drill." He thought it was real. He fired the real alert. He did his job, right? So the person who was at fault was the supervisor who designed the drill. It was a drill, and he put the words, "This is not a drill," in it, right? You can't do that. So he's out of a job now. So he's actually resigned and is the one who's at fault. But everybody was pointing their finger at this person who pushed the button, and they were told it's not a drill.
Yeah.
And so they were doing their job. So it just shows, again, not computers. People are normally the problems that lead to these things.
Well, and the other thing I read about that after the fact is they were giving a lot of heat to the governor of Hawaii because it took him 40 minutes to tweet out that this was, in fact, a drill and no one's in danger. And they were saying the delay was because he didn't know his Twitter password. And, you know, at this point, he's probably at home at this time of day. I believe it was on the weekend, I think. So, you know, he's not at the office. And I have sympathy for the guy because chances are he's got a social media team that's handling those tweets for him, or it's in Hootsuite. It's in something like that where, you know, he's not just picking up his phone and tweeting like other government officials. But, but you know, the fact that it took him 40 minutes is probably because he's just getting on the phone going, "Who has this password? I need to tell the citizens of Hawaii that they're not going to die."
And he's probably asking himself, why is Twitter the way I communicate with my constituency?
Yes.
Like, that makes no sense.
Yeah, can we not send out a second alert on this same system that we had that says, "Oops"? But yeah, what a mess. But it makes for great podcast stories, doesn't it? Yeah, I can't wait to see what happens next. I just hope it's not us that does something stupid. But
Maybe one of the Australian cabinet members will be on Jeopardy.
Oh,
And we can tie all this together.
just
Like,
bring it full circle. Yeah, well, I'm really excited because on this, I've got the CNN article up here too, and on the right, I just see a headline that says Jeopardy contestant fails to answer a single. And so when this is done, I got to go watch that.
Awesome.
So I'm excited. So get on CNN, folks. All right, well, that's going to do it for this week on the podcast. Thank you so much for joining us for week 5 of 2018. If you haven't done so already, please take a moment, subscribe to the podcast, share it with your friends. Go ahead and give us a rating. We'd really appreciate that. Helps us move up in the rankings on iTunes, Stitcher, all those other great services, TuneIn, Google Play. But for now, anything else, Don?
yeah, that's all we've got. So, you know, thank you guys for watching. And be sure to check back in next week because who knows what craziness is going to ensue in IT over the next 7 days. It's madness out there.
I can't wait. And burn your files, folks. We'll see you next time.